The subject of baptism has often generated a debate within the church. On one end, you have some people who say that the water baptism itself is able to apply grace to the soul. Maybe even they will say that it can save the soul. Whereas Baptists, we would maintain that no, water baptism is a symbol of what has already happened in the life of that individual. They've already received Jesus Christ, they've been washed from their sins, they've repented, and the water baptism is kind of like a first step of obedience that we do to demonstrate to the world in the way that Jesus commanded us that we now belong to Him. One aspect biblically of baptism is this is what the Lord does in salvation. He washes us. And then it's the ordinance, the water baptism, that symbolizes that salvation. In Romans 6:3, we have the theological meaning of baptism, and it talks about salvation, whereas in the book of Acts particularly, as the disciples obeyed the Great Commission, we see the water baptism symbolizing that salvation work that the Lord does in the life of the individual. In 1 Corinthians 6:11, we have a really interesting verb that describes baptism. And this is my translation. And such things were some of you, but you washed yourselves, but you were sanctified, but you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and in the Spirit of our God. The word that I translated, you washed yourselves, which might be a little awkward, but I think it demonstrates the point I'm trying to make, is that the verb is apelusaste. This comes from apalua, which means wash. We're going to study in this chapter the tense formative for first aorists, which is sigma alpha. So if you look towards the end of this word, right before that middle passive ending, you'll see the sigma alpha, and then you see the middle passive ending. Well, the aorists, that we're going to see the active voice has a particular formation, the middle voice has a particular formation, and later on we'll study the passive voice and its formation. But the middle voice doesn't share the same form as the passive, and so they're distinct. And this here has more of a reflexive nuance. And the question is, well, the other two verbs that come after are clearly passive. And if you look at the English translation, you were sanctified. Well, who can sanctify an individual? Only God can do that. What about justification? You were justified in the name of the Lord. Well, only God can do that. And those two verbs in Greek are passive, just like they are in the translation. But this one, which refers to baptism, is middle. And the question is, well, why would the apostle put that verb in the middle? And it's because the idea is that these Corinthians were responsible for submitting to the ordinance of baptism. Who washes the soul of the individual? Only God can do that. But who's responsible for water baptism? Well, Jesus commanded that we be baptized, that we should go baptizing, but also it's our role, if we've believed, to be baptized as well. And that's something that we submit to, and we have a role. It's kind of like that verse that says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, because it's God that works in you. So there's this dual aspect. God provides the salvation, but there are things that we're responsible to do. And the fact that this verb appears in middle voice shows that we are responsible for this aspect of obedience. Submit to the ordinance of baptism. There's two past tenses in Greek, the aorist and the imperfect. The aorist denotes undefined action, and an example would be, she went to the youth meeting. So it's not really saying much about the activity, just the fact that it happened. Parallel in the imperfect tense would be, she was going to the meeting when she happened to meet her friend. The imperfect often sets the stage for more action that's going to be described in that context. And so this is incomplete or imperfected action. The imperfect is kind of like watching a parade from the street. You're watching it go by, you can see a little more of the details, whereas the aorist is kind of like watching a parade from a helicopter. If you go up in a helicopter, or sometimes over the sporting events there's a blimp, you can see the whole thing, a snapshot view of the action. And that's what the aorist does better than the imperfect. The difference between these two is one of aspect, the kind of action. So we've said that the aorist denotes generally undefined action, whereas the imperfect generally denotes incomplete action. Sometimes these tenses are stylistic, and we shouldn't push too much of the aspect that we're learning into the verbs as we see them in the context. We want to let the context inform us how the author is using these tenses, but this is the general distinction between the two. So the aorist is kind of like seeing the action from way up above, a snapshot view of the action. Let's take a look at a couple of these in their context. This verse would be translated, "For John came to you in the way of righteousness, kai uk epistusate." We're going to learn and study a little bit more in depth the sa, the tense-formative sa, which denotes aoristic or undefined action. And there it is, right after the verbal stem. And it's the second person plural ending te. So it would be translated, "And you did not believe." Not "you were not believing" necessarily, because it's the aorist. You did not believe, period. Here's another one. "And we heard this voice sent from heaven." So kai tauten, this, ten phonen, voice, and this voice, chemes ekusamen, we heard. Okay, and so we've got, this is from akuo, and sa, there's the tense formative, and men, first plural active. So we translate this, we heard. So this is just the undefined form of the verb, which means to hear. So in its formation in English, generally we form a verb that's past and undefined with ed. Now, there is some variation to this. So if I say I kick the can. If we say it in the past undefined tense, we would say I kicked the can. Normally they form with ed. Sometimes they might be like I sleep. If it's past tense, I slept. This time it forms with the t. Or sometimes there will be other changes like I eat. In the past tense, it would be I ate. And so there are irregular verbs, if you will, but generally they form with ed. In Greek, these past undefined verbs are going to form with the tense formative sa. So this is kind of like the ed, if you will, in Greek. When we look at the passive voice, we're going to see that, well, that takes a different tense formative. This aorist, the aorist that takes the sigma alpha, that happens in the active and middle. The passive will take a separate tense formative. So let's take a look at it here. The augment, since it's a past tense, it will have the augment, and then will come the verbal stem. These first aorists, we've already looked at the second aorist that formed from the root. So these first aorists, their stem is pretty much always going to be just like the verb that we learn in its lexical form. So pistuo, epistusate, there we've got the stem as we saw it in the vocab section. No change there, so that should be helpful for our learning. The tense formative sigma alpha, the ending is te, and the meaning here would be you believed, like we saw earlier in the verse. Akusamen, here we see that the alpha, which begins the word akuo, the augment has lengthened, or I should say the alpha has lengthened because of the augment. And this often happens when there's a verb that starts with a vowel. The augment will cause it to lengthen. We talked about that with the imperfects too. Then comes the tense formative, and then comes the ending. So it'd be translated, we heard. Let's look at the different forms here using lu. In the active voice, we would have elusa. What's a little different about this is the first aorists don't take the ending nu. They're a little irregular that way. So it's really easy to get confused between the first singular elusa and the third singular elusen, which will sometimes have the nu. It's a movable nu. The first singular doesn't have one, so try to write that into your memory bank right now. Elusa means I loosed. Then we've got elusas, you loosed. Elusen, he loosed. Elusamen, we loosed. Elusate, you loosed. And elusan, they loosed. So what makes this verb distinct is the fact that it has the augment and the secondary endings, although the first singular is an exception, and that it has the sigma alpha tense formative. If we look at the middle voice, not a lot of changes here. We've got the augment, we've got the secondary endings, and we're going to keep the sigma alpha tense formative. So elusamen, there's a possibility that the verb will be deponent, or but sometimes we'll want to include the reflexive idea. We don't have to wonder, but what if it's passive? Well, no, if it's an aorist passive, it'll have a separate tense formative, a separate formation that we'll study a little bit later. So elusamen would be I loosed myself, perhaps, or eluso, you loosed yourself. Elusata, he loosed himself. Elusametha, we loosed ourselves. Elusasthe, you loosed yourselves. Or elusanta, they loosed themselves. Here's a few points to remember. When sigma alpha is added to a verb whose stem ends in an alpha, epsilon, or omicron, the vowel before the sigma alpha will normally lengthen. So if we look at a verb like agapao, which means I love, if it's converted to the aorist tense, well, for one, we've got agapesa. For one, the alpha lengthens to an eta because of the augment. Then we've got the sigma alpha without an ending. Remember, that's how the first singular forms. But then look right before the sigma alpha, the letter that's underlined. That was an alpha. What happened? Well, it lengthened. And that's because if the verb's stem ends in an alpha, epsilon, or omicron, it's going to lengthen before the tense formative. With the same kind of thing happens with future tenses. If you've forgotten it or if it sounds strange, this should just be a reminder that before the tense formative, the vowel lengthens. When one of the labial, velar, or dental letters, remember these are letters from the square of stops, when they meet the sigma, they will fuse. That shouldn't be too strange for us since we've already seen how the square of stops works. So if we have a verb like blepo, I see, if it was written in Greek to mean I saw, it would be eblepsa. The pi or the p meets a sigma and it becomes a psi, eblepsa. And then there's these liquid verbs. These are verbs whose stem ends in a lambda, mu, nu, or rho. And when they are aorists, they're going to take an alpha instead of a sigma alpha. It could be that it was just too difficult for the Greeks to roll the sigma off their tongue after pronouncing one of these liquid letters. But this is how they formed it. It's going to be an alpha instead of a sigma alpha. Sometimes when these liquid verbs appear, we're going to see that their stem has changed a little bit. So here's an example, meno, which means I remain. We might see something written, emenamen par autois. Emenamen. Well, what happened here? Okay, well, it's got the augment. And instead of a sigma alpha, it has just an alpha that comes after the stem that changed a little bit. It's the stem in the present tense is men, but the stem here is main. Emenamen. This is a first plural, aorist, active, indicative, and it would be translated, we stayed with them. This kind of thing is very normal for liquid aorist verbs. Another example would be apostello. The stem changes a little bit in the aorist, and for one of the lambdas drops out, but there's the addition of a iota. And again, it just has an alpha instead of a sigma alpha as its tense formative. So if we saw su me apostelos, this would be translated, you sent me. So a few things just to keep in mind as we begin our translation of these first aorist verbs. So here are all the verbal endings for review. I'm going to go through each of the columns and you can review as I go. Think about the endings and if there's any change in how it actually looks on the form of the verb. So we have luo, lues, lue, luamen, luete, luusin. And then for the middle passive, for the primary endings, luamai, lue, because of the contraction, luetai, luametha, luesthe, luantai. And then we've got the secondary endings, eluan, elues, eluen, eluamen, eluete, eluan. Keep in mind that the augment always goes with the secondary endings and vice versa. And then the middle passive, eluamen, eluu, elueta, eluametha, eluesthe, and eluanta. To this point, we've learned 4 tenses: the present, the imperfect, the future, and the aorist. Why don't you take just a moment right now to pause the video and review the 4 tenses that we've learned today. The second aorists do not appear on here. These are the tenses that are very common. The first aorist is a little more common than the second aorist. So take a moment, pause the video, and review all of these and try to keep them clear in your mind.